It began, as such things often do in Flaxborough, with a distinctly undignified splash. On the first Saturday of October, just as the brass band was belting out a slightly optimistic rendition of Jerusalem in the town square, a curious incident at the Flaxborough Harvest Festival interrupted the proceedings with a sloshing of brown liquid and the shriek of a very startled mayor's wife. Mrs. Audrey Clenthorpe, resplendent in a sunflower print dress and 2 shades too much rouge, had been addressing the gathered crowd with a rehearsed paean to civic harmony when the trestle table behind her gave a sudden groan and collapsed. A large wooden barrel, proudly labelled Proudfoot's Autumn Ale, brewed 1932, rebarreled 2025, had been balanced precariously on a crate of hymnals and, with an alarming inevitability, it toppled forward. The bung popped with a satisfying pop. The contents erupted in a frothy brown torrent down the mayor's wife's stockings, flooding her sensible pumps and pooling across the cobblestones with a faint, yeasty tang. Audrey shrieked, the band faltered, and the local photographer caught the moment mid-flail, her straw hat suspended an inch above her head. "My God, it's like she's being baptized by beer," muttered Councillor Widmerpool, only to be elbowed sharply by his wife. Within 20 minutes, the Market Arms was packed with those who had witnessed, those who claimed to have witnessed, and those willing to recreate the moment with beer mats and salt shakers. "Oh, I heard it was a different barrel entirely. One from the town hall cellars, left out by accident." "Well, I heard, mister." Proudfoot was so nervous about the quality of this year's batch. He replaced it with last year's, but forgot to reseal the bung. "Rubbish. It was deliberate. To humiliate Mrs. Clenthorpe. You know she chaired the committee that stopped his distillery permit, don't you? Deliberate or not, she'll be fermenting under that frock for days. I saw Reverend Fallow fussing with the barrels 10 minutes before. Said something about realigning the spiritual balance. She never screamed like that when the Dean of Boston had the goose-fat incident. And through it all, at the back of the square, quietly examining the scene, stood Inspector Purbright. He was not looking at the barrel or Mrs. Clenthorpe's now slightly pickled ankles. Nor did he appear to be paying particular attention to the trampled hymn sheets that had, inexplicably, been mixed among the debris. What caught his eye instead was something far subtler, a small pale blue handkerchief, embroidered with the initial E, draped, sodden and half unfolded, over the broken slats of the table. It had no business being there. No one seemed to notice it, and Purbright, after a moment's thoughtful pause, made no move to disturb it. By now, Sergeant Love had returned with 2 cups of tea and a slightly squashed Eccles cake, looking flustered. "She says she'll sue," he said, gesturing toward the mayor's wife, now seated on a folding chair, towel-wrapped and fuming. "People often threaten to sue when they've been made ridiculous in public," said Purbright mildly, accepting the tea. "But rarely over barrels of beer." Love blinked. "You don't think it was on purpose, do you, sir?" Purbright sipped and gave a dry smile. "That, Sergeant, rather depends on who benefits most from a public soaking and the spoilage of an allegedly historic ale." Love nodded gravely, though it was clear he hadn't quite followed. "Still, we'll need to get a statement from the brewer, huh?" "Ah, yes. Mr. Proudfoot. A man with a reputation for strong opinions and even stronger spirits. I believe he's already retreating behind his fermentation tanks." Indeed, Percy Proudfoot had fled the scene almost immediately after the incident, muttering something about ungrateful townsfolk and stupid bloody barrels. A witness claimed he'd knocked over a bicycle in his haste. But the real surprise came not an hour later, as Purbright and Love stepped into the brewer's shop down Maltby Lane. The front window was dark. The hanging sign, "You Old Flaxborough Brewing Company," swayed in the breeze, creaking with the kind of unease only Flaxborough seemed capable of producing. Inside, a faint scent of hops lingered in the air. The bell above the door tinkled. No answer. The office door at the back stood ajar. Purbright pushed it with the tip of his umbrella. Percy Proudfoot sat slumped in his chair, chin sunk to chest, a glass still half full beside him. The silence was immediate and heavy. "Percy?" Love called gently. He didn't stir. Purbright moved closer, noting the peculiar angle of the man's neck. Then his gaze settled on the sideboard. On it sat a silver frame holding a photograph of a much younger Proudfoot, with a woman smiling tightly at his side, and beside it, a leather-bound receipt book. Open. The last entry, barely dry, bore the name E. Cribbin and the sum of £70. Purbright tilted his head. "Curious," he murmured. Love's voice trembled slightly. "You think he's—" Purbright knelt and touched the man's wrist. No pulse. Though his glass suggests he expected a longer evening, but who's E. Cribbin? "That," said Purbright, rising slowly, "may become our next question." He turned to the door. But before they could step outside, a loud crack sounded from the direction of the brewery floor, followed by the unmistakable, gurgling hiss of another barrel giving way. The hiss of ruptured pressure echoed through the brewery like a sigh from the building itself. Long, wet, and filled with something that might once have been pride. Purbright stepped forward with calm urgency, motioning for Love to follow, and they crossed through a wooden doorway into the shadowy production floor. The air was damp and thick with the ghost of barley. Rows of old oak barrels stood like squat sentinels, each ringed with rusted iron hoops, many marked with chalk in a hand that had grown progressively shakier down the line. One of them, a broad-shouldered brute near the center, was leaking a slow stream of foam from its side, forming a widening puddle that snaked its way toward a drain. But it was the silence that unnerved Sergeant Love. Breweries were supposed to hum, pipes, hisses, drips, clanks. Yet here, aside from the wounded cask, there was nothing. No flickering radio, no muttered curses from the back room, no signs of work at all. "Someone let this barrel go deliberately," Love said, crouching beside it. "Look, chisel marks near the seal." Purbright examined the gouges and gave a thoughtful hum. Not clumsy sabotage. Precise enough to ensure it ruptured gradually, not explosively. Whoever did this didn't want a bang. They wanted a spectacle. Love scratched his head. But why ruin a second barrel? The first one embarrassed the mayor's wife. This one, what, to distract us from Proudfoot? Purbright gave a faint nod. Or to send a message. One we were meant to witness. They returned to the office. Proudfoot's body remained in the chair, his features caught between weariness and something sharper. Disbelief, perhaps. The glass was still half full, untouched, though the bottle beside it, an unlabeled blend, likely one of his private experiments, was nearly drained. "Should I call Dr. Fergus?" asked Love, glancing down at the man's slackened jaw. "In a moment," Purbright said. He opened the leather-bound receipt book again, flipping back through the entries with slow precision. Names marched across the page, mostly routine deliveries. Churchwardens, publicans, a few surnames that suggested quiet arrangements between neighbors. But E. Cribbin stood out. "She's the baker's cousin, isn't she?" Love asked. "Lives up on Quarley Crescent. Widow? Keeps bees. Among other things," murmured Purbright. "Look at the amount." £70. Oddly large for a private order, especially in cash. Love frowned. "Could be hush money. Or leverage," said Purbright, his eyes narrowing. "Let's pay her a visit before the chatter gets to her first." They left the brewery, locking the door behind them, and notified the station to send for Dr. Fergus and a constable to stand guard. The walk to Quarley Crescent took them up a mild hill, past rows of modest semi-detached homes, each one adorned with seasonal banners for the harvest festival. Children darted in and out of garden gates, chasing hoops or shouting about who'd seen the barrel burst first. In Flaxborough, even a death couldn't stop the gossip from breathing. Mrs. Eunice Cribbin greeted them with an expression of wary warmth. She was a woman of perhaps 65, slim to the point of austerity, with the pinched dignity of someone who had once hosted bridge evenings and now preferred silence. Her bees buzzed lazily around a flowering clematis in the front garden. "I suppose this is about Percy," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "I heard something had happened." "Figured you'd come knocking. We found your name in his receipt book," said Purbright, settling into a chair she offered. "Rather a large sum." She gave a brief, bitter laugh. "I paid for silence. Figured he'd keep his promise if I sweetened the pot." "What promise was that?" She hesitated, then poured herself a cup of weak tea before answering. "To stop selling the King's Bitter to George Tuddock. My late husband's recipe. Percy said he'd come up with it himself, but we both know better." Love blinked. "The King's Bitter? That's in every pub in town." "Exactly," she said flatly. "My husband developed it in 1989. Percy was his apprentice then. Took the formula after he died. I never could prove it, not in court, but I had Percy's notes. He knew I'd found them." Purbright's eyes flicked toward the hallway, where a coat stand held a scarf and a man's umbrella. The air here was scented faintly with honey and old yeast. "Why now?" he asked. She looked away. "Because he threatened to destroy the papers if I didn't let it go. Said I was clinging to the past like old yeast on a cracked vat. So I paid him off. In return, he said he'd pull the batch. Cease production. But I don't suppose he did know," said Purbright quietly. "It seems he didn't." She set her cup down with trembling fingers. "You think someone killed him over it?" "That would depend," said Purbright, rising, "on how many people were promised things by a man who brewed secrets as readily as beer." As they stepped back out into the afternoon, clouds gathered. Purbright paused at the garden gate, his eye caught by a pale blue scrap hanging from the hedge. A handkerchief, embroidered with the initial E. The pale blue handkerchief hung limply from a thorn in the hedge, its embroidered E just visible against the fading thread. Purbright plucked it gently between thumb and forefinger, holding it to the light like a curious leaf. Love leaned closer. "Same one, sir?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. The cloth was damp but not stained. No sign of beer or mud. It hadn't come from the brewery floor, at least not recently. "Possibly," he said at last. "But even if not, its existence here is inconvenient." Love frowned. "Why?" "Because Eunice Cribbin told us she hadn't left the house since yesterday morning. And yet this looks as though it's been recently dropped." Love shifted his weight, looking uneasily at the quiet road. "Think she was lying?" "I think," Purbright said, folding the handkerchief and placing it in his pocket, "that people in Flaxborough rarely lie outright. They just misplace the truth, slightly, usually in service of something they'd rather not revisit." They returned to the station just as Dr. Fergus's report arrived. The medical officer, characteristically brief, noted signs of cyanosis and an unusual odor from the glass, suggesting a compound not native to alcohol alone. "Highly likely," the note concluded, "that Mr. Proudfoot ingested a small dose of mercuric chloride. Quick-acting, slipped into his drink less than an hour before death." "Murder, then," said Love, setting the note down. "Or suicide staged to resemble it," said Purbright, though suicides rarely bother with theatrics. Love nodded slowly. "So either someone poisoned him while he was drinking, or they laced the glass before he arrived." Purbright turned back to the ledger. "If it were in the glass, the assumption is that the killer had access to his office. Which narrows it, but not by much. This town's history with keys is elastic." Love cleared his throat. "That other name, sir, George Tuddock, Should we talk to him? A good instinct, said Purbright. Mr. Tuddock has a long-standing relationship with secrets and short accounts. Let's catch him before he decides to have a stroke of selective memory. The Tuddock Free House, an unfortunate blend of Edwardian brickwork and modern signage, stood like a sneer at the end of Hollow Street. The afternoon trade was thin, and George Tuddock himself was behind the bar, drying glasses and humming a tuneless rendition of "There is a Tavern in the Town." He had a chin like a baking tin, and a manner that always suggested he had just been caught doing something faintly improper. "Inspector," he said as they entered, "come to confiscate my peanuts or arrest me for licensing too much cheer." "Neither," said Purbright. "We're here about Percy Proudfoot." Tuddock's humming ceased. "I heard," he said slowly. "Terrible business. Old Percy gone." "You were close, were you?" asked Purbright. "We had dealings," said Tuddock, "but no one was close to Percy." "He was a brewer first," man's second love asked. "You bought the King's Bitter from him?" Tuddock shrugged. "Course I did. Bestseller. People come in just for it. Had 2 barrels delivered last Thursday. Was that unusual?" "Well, we usually get 1. But he said there'd been confusion at the bottling plant. Wanted to make it right." Purbright leaned on the bar. "And you saw him yesterday?" "Briefly. Dropped in for a tot before the festival. Said he had something to sort out with a lady in town. Wouldn't say who. Gave me a funny look, too. Like he knew something and wasn't telling." "Was he carrying anything?" "A small parcel," Tuddock said, "wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a loaf. Smelled sharp, like cloves or something stronger." Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "Would you mind," he asked Tuddock, "if we had a quick look in your cellar?" Tuddock gave a short laugh. "What for? Fermented confessions?" "Routine check," Purbright said pleasantly, "since you were one of the last to see him." The cellar was cool, musty, and stacked with barrels, all clearly labeled and recently tapped. But it was the corner that drew Purbright's attention, a section behind the spare stools where a sack of empty bottles had been partially moved. Resting beneath it was a second handkerchief. Pale blue. Torn at the corner. Love lifted it carefully. "Sir, this one's stained. Brown not beer." "Blood?" Love offered. "Or tincture," said Purbright. "Either way, it's travelling." They stepped back into the pub, but Tuddock was no longer behind the bar. The front door stood open, the bell still jangling. Love swore under his breath. "He's done a runner." "Let's hope," Purbright said, eyes scanning the pavement. "He runs somewhere obvious." "Rats often do." As they stepped outside, a distant shout from down the lane caught their ears. Then a squeal of tires. A Morris Minor sped off in the direction of the river road, leaving behind only exhaust and a flutter of discarded paper that drifted like a rejected confession toward the gutter. The Morris Minor, a once primrose vehicle now dulled by years of neglect and pub yard dust, tore down the high street with a wheeze and rattle entirely out of proportion to its power. Tuddock's flight was not graceful, nor was it quick, but it was certainly conspicuous. 2 delivery boys on bicycles swerved to avoid him, one shouting something impolite. A florist's bucket rolled into the gutter, its tulips flung like accusations. "Shall I call the station car?" Love asked breathlessly as they jogged past the tobacconists. "No time," said Purbright. "He'll be lucky to reach the weir without the clutch collapsing." They took a shortcut through the churchyard, hopping over a stone border and startling a woman arranging dahlias on a grave. As they emerged near the fishmonger's, the miner lurched around the bend toward Pilchard Lane, its left blinker inexplicably flashing despite the absence of any turn. "Where would he go?" Love asked, panting. "If he's sensible, nowhere far," said Purbright. "But if he's guilty, anywhere familiar enough to feel safe." 2 minutes later, they found the car, Door flung open, engine sputtering to a halt. Abandoned in the side alley behind the co-op. Tuddock had not gone far. A shout from behind the loading dock led them around to the narrow back garden of Miss Shuttlethwaite's tea rooms, where a neatly pruned trellis lay in ruins and a muddy footprint adorned the bird bath. Love spotted him first. Tuddock was crouched beneath the pergola, his cheeks ruddy, hands trembling. In one fist, absurdly, he still clutched the same dishcloth he'd been drying glasses with. Purbright approached without hurry. Not the most strategic escape, Mr. Tuddock. The man stood, panting. I didn't kill him. No one said you had. Then why chase me like I'm a blinking stage villain? Because stage villains, said Purbright, at least wait for the curtain. You left before we'd finished our conversation. Tuddock slumped against the fence. Look, I panicked. That handkerchief, you were going to pin it on me. No, said Purbright, but I did want to know why there are 2 blue handkerchiefs, both marked with an E, and one of them hidden behind your cellar bottles. I didn't put it there, Tuddock said quickly. I swear, someone must have. Look, people have keys to that place. I've lost 3 in the last decade. It's practically a public thoroughfare back there. Yet you ran. I ran because Eunice Cribben told me not to say anything. Love blinked. Told you not to talk to us. She came by the pub the night before the festival, said Tuddock, licking his lips. Said if Percy started stirring up talk about the king's bitter, I was to keep my mouth shut. Said it'd be better for both of us if we let the past stay dead. Did she threaten you? She didn't have to. Just reminded me I've still got 3 years left on a loan she guaranteed. The sort of reminder that carries an unspoken clause. Purbright's expression was unreadable. And the brown paper parcel Percy brought you, what became of it? Tuddock hesitated. He never gave it to me. Said he had second thoughts. Took it back when he left. Said it wasn't for me after all. Did he say who it was for? No, but he muttered something. They'll never let it go. I assumed he meant the council. Or her. By now the local constable had caught up, hat askew and notebook damp with sweat. Purbright instructed him to escort Tuddock back to the station, but gently. No need for cuffs. Shame works better here. As the man was led away, Purbright stood in the ruined tea garden and looked around. The sky had dulled, early autumn clouds sweeping over in soft grey folds. A sparrow fluttered down to the shattered bird bath, splashed once and took off again, unimpressed. Eunice Cribben seems to orbit quite a few moving pieces, Love said quietly. You think she planted that handkerchief at Tuddock's? Possibly. But what's more likely is someone wants us to believe she did. They returned to the station as the first fine rain began to fall. On Purbright's desk sat an envelope, unaddressed but sealed with wax. Sergeant Love eyed it warily. Anonymous? Almost certainly. Purbright broke the seal and unfolded the contents. Inside was a single photograph, its edges scalloped, the surface slightly curled. It showed 4 people, a much younger Proudfoot, George Tuddock, Eunice Cribben, and a man neither of them immediately recognized. Balding, thick glasses, standing apart from the others as if added in later. On the back, a scrawl of ink read, King's Bitter, 1990, Our Secret. Purbright exhaled slowly. Well now, he said, the past hasn't stayed dead after all. The photograph lay between them like a quiet accusation. Purbright held it at an angle to the desk lamp, letting the gloss catch the light. George Tuddock's smirk, Proudfoot's barrel-chested stance, Eunice Cribben's folded hands, and the 4th man, gaunt, unsmiling, seemingly misplaced in the composition, formed an unsteady tableau. Love, perched on the corner of the desk, tapped the image thoughtfully. He doesn't fit, he said, pointing to the 4th figure. Too stiff. Like he didn't want to be there or wasn't meant to be. Purbright murmured. The others are close. He's distant, unnatural even for a posed photo. What's this? Our secret? Love asked, flipping the picture back over. That's the recipe for King's Bitter? Purbright nodded faintly. It seems that drink was more collaborative than Proudfoot ever admitted. Which raises a question. Who benefits most from the truth staying hidden, and who's willing to kill for it? Love frowned. We've got Eunice with the motive. Tuddock in panic. Proudfoot dead. That leaves... This man Purbright opened the station's local archive ledger. We'll cross-reference the council brewing permits from 1990. If the batch was registered under multiple names, this man may show up. Love reached for the phone, but before he could dial, Constable Perks knocked gently on the door, hat in hand. Sir, there's been an incident at the town hall. You'll want to see it. 5 minutes later, they stood in the main foyer of Flaxborough Town Hall, surrounded by the debris of a toppled display case. Glass glittered across the tiled floor. At the center of it all, a framed council certificate lay shattered, its contents curled and damp where someone had hurled a mug of tea over it. A janitor swept half-heartedly nearby. Didn't hear any break-in, he said. Just came back from my rounds and found it like this. Doors were still locked. The certificate had been part of a council commemoration. Heritage Producers of Flaxborough. Proudfoot's Brewery was among the names listed. A quick glance confirmed something curious. Look, said Love, crouching beside it. There's a name missing. One's been scratched off. You can still see the indent. Purbright studied it, brows raised. Initials R.C. He straightened. Roderick Copley, former chemist, worked in industrial flavoring, retired to Flaxborough in '92, died in 2003, briefly associated with local bottling guilds. Love blinked. You think that's our man in the photo? Quite possibly. If so, he was the technical brains behind King's Bitter, which makes the label on every bottle, and who can claim ownership? More complicated than anyone wants it to be. And someone broke in to erase his name, Love said. That's not a prank. That's a cover-up. As they walked back to the station, passing shop windows and pairs of old women peering over hydrangea hedges, Love spoke again. We should check Copley's next of kin. If he left anything behind, journals, formulae. Good thinking, said Purbright, though I'd wager we're not the only ones searching for what he left behind. Back at the office, a fax had arrived from a solicitor in Brackmere, responding to an inquiry Purbright had sent days ago in a separate matter. Love read it aloud while Purbright opened his drawer and laid the photograph beside the handkerchiefs. Regarding the estate of the late Roderick Copley, Love recited, please note that his last remaining effects were auctioned locally in 2004. A handwritten brewing ledger, Lot 17, was purchased by Mr. Percy Proudfoot. That ledger, Purbright said slowly, would have contained the original formula. If Proudfoot had it, it would explain why he could lord over the others. Eunice, Tuddock, anyone else connected to the blend. But it also means, Love said, that whoever poisoned him might have been after that ledger. They looked at each other. But we didn't find it at the brewery, Love continued. Nothing but the sales ledger and invoices. Then it was taken, said Purbright, either before or after the murder. Possibly both. He glanced again at the receipt book. The final entry, E. Cribbin, £70. The largest sum in weeks. She said it was a bribe, Purbright said. But what if it was a purchase? You think she bought the formula back? Or thought she did, he said. We'll need to revisit her. Gently. Before they could rise, another knock came. This time it was Councillor Widmerpool, flushed, slightly breathless, and visibly annoyed. I hope I'm not interrupting, Inspector, he said, clearly intending to do exactly that. But the festival committee is in disarray, and Audrey Clenthrop is threatening to resign unless you confirm this incident won't ruin our funding. Purbright gave a patient smile. "We're doing everything to resolve the situation." Widmer Poole lowered his voice. "And between us, if the late Mr. Proudfoot left behind anything questionable, I'd prefer it be kept off record. We've applied for a civic grant. Wouldn't do to have a scandal hanging over us." "Of course," said Purbright mildly. "We'll be careful not to disturb any sleeping barrels unnecessarily." As Widmer Poole departed, Love looked after him. "Do you think he's involved?" "I think," said Purbright, "that several people are very invested in keeping a dead man's secrets buried. But secrets, Sergeant, tend to ferment under pressure, until something explodes." The soft clinking of rain on the station windows was a rhythmic, contemplative sound, the sort that slowed conversation and quickened thought. Purbright leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling, fingertips pressed together as if in silent orchestration. Love sat across from him with the photograph balanced on one knee, frowning at it as though it might shift under scrutiny. "You think Eunice paid for the formula," Love said. "But if Proudfoot had already promised it to her, why take the money?" "Because he never promised it," Purbright said. "He hinted. He suggested. He leveraged. Proudfoot lived off implication. Likely sold the same promise to two people and thought himself clever for it. So if she gave him the money and didn't get the ledger, she'd be angry," Purbright finished. "But she wouldn't kill him, not unless she realized he meant to sell it to someone else." There was a pause. Love looked down. "Tuddock?" "Possibly," Purbright said. "Or someone further removed?" "Councillor Widmer Poole, for instance." Love squinted. "What would he want with a beer recipe?" "Not the recipe. The grant. A town with a heritage brew attached to a council-endorsed legacy becomes attractive to tourism boards and investors. Proudfoot's sudden, historical barrel at the festival wasn't just showmanship. It was rebranding. A revival. Widmer Poole may have backed him. If Eunice threatened that by demanding her share of the credit or even exposure of the original formula, it could sink the bid. Love sat back. So she pays Proudfoot, he double-crosses her, and before she can act, someone else steps in to shut him up. Perhaps. Purbright stood. "Let's see if Mrs. Cribbin is still willing to entertain visitors." The Cribbin house looked different in the rain. The ivy clung damply to the eaves, and the windows were fogged with the warmth of a fire within. Eunice answered the door in a wool cardigan, her expression unreadable. "Back again?" she asked without surprise. "I'm afraid so," said Purbright gently. "We've had some new information." She let them in, and this time the tea was already steeping. Purbright remained standing. "You told us you gave Percy £70 to stop brewing King's Bitter. What if I told you that same sum was written beside a parcel purchase?" Her mouth twitched just slightly. "Then I'd say Percy lied to someone. Likely me. Did he ever give you anything in return?" She hesitated, then crossed the room to a writing desk. From a drawer, she retrieved a small brown envelope, creased, watermarked, but sealed. "I was told not to open it," she said. "Not until after the festival." That's what he said. "Wait until the bunting's down and the ale's dry." Purbright accepted it carefully. The seal wasn't wax but glue, hastily pressed and brittle at the edges. Inside was a single folded sheet of thick stationery, written in Proudfoot's hand. It was not the formula. It was a letter. "Eunice," it read, "you'll get your share, I promise. But things have changed. Widmer Poole's made an offer, and frankly, it's too good. You'll still benefit, just in a quieter way. No need to stir the barrel more than necessary. The past can stay buried, so long as it's profitable. No signature. Just the date, one day before the festival." Eunice's voice was calm, but her grip on the mug betrayed the tension. "So I was to be bought off." Again. "You didn't open this before?" Purbright asked. She looked him in the eye. "No, because I didn't want to know what lie he'd sold me this time." Love shifted. Did you keep the ledger? The original. I never had it, she said, her voice flat. I thought I was buying it, but I suspect he either sold it to Widmerpool or still had it when he died. Purbright looked back at the envelope. Do you mind if we keep this? She nodded. You're welcome to it. Percy's promises are your problem now. As they stepped back into the drizzle, Love exhaled slowly. So now Widmerpool's at the center. Perhaps, Purbright said. But I'm beginning to think the real question isn't who wanted the formula. It's who knew Percy had already lost it. Lost it. Purbright's eyes narrowed. Or had it stolen. He wouldn't double-cross so many people unless he felt safe. Unless he believed no one else could prove ownership. Love blinked. So someone took the ledger before the murder? Possibly. Or he never had it to begin with. In which case, someone else does. And they might be the most dangerous person in this affair. As they crossed the street, a figure hurried by under an umbrella, barely a glance at the pair of them, but enough for Purbright to notice something odd. A flash of blue silk at the hem of the coat. Pale, monogrammed. Not E.L., Purbright murmured, watching the figure disappear down North Row. We've been looking at the wrong initial all along. It was a subtle flicker, just a flash of embroidered silk where a coat hem had lifted against the wind, but for Inspector Purbright, it cast the entire case in a new light. As the figure turned the corner, umbrella tilted against the drizzle, he registered not just the pale blue monogram stitched into the handkerchief partially stuffed into a pocket, but the letter itself, Lil. Love hadn't noticed. He was still puzzling over the letter from Proudfoot as they walked. What kind of man sells the same promise 3 times over and expects to get away with it? One who believes he owns the lock on the door, Purbright replied, but we've been too fixated on the recipients of those promises. Perhaps it's time to consider who else was present in the background. Quiet, overlooked, but close enough to every transaction. Who do you think that was? Purbright glanced once, more at the now empty street, then turned back toward the station. Someone who handles records. Who touches receipts, plans, and civic minutes? Someone with knowledge of what Percy was doing, but no obvious stake. Love frowned. You mean someone in the council office? Or adjacent to it? They arrived at the station to find that the evidence room had finally produced a bag of personal effects, taken from Proudfoot's office, gathered before the constables had locked the door. Among them was a penknife, a broken stopwatch, a folded newspaper clipping about the Heritage Grant scheme, and a ticket stub for a council planning session dated 3 weeks earlier. Purbright tapped the stub. He attended this, and I suspect he brought something with him, perhaps the ledger, perhaps not. But he wouldn't come empty-handed if he meant to court the council's favor. Love nodded. The other names on that committee? I checked earlier. Widmerpool chaired it. Audrey Clenthrop was listed, and so was Lillian Harbottle. Love blinked. Miss Harbottle, the archives clerk, 31 years in the same office, the sort of woman who knows when a chair squeaks or a paperclip goes missing. She maintains the town records, including historical brew licenses. If anyone knew the true origin of King's Bitter, it would be her. And the L? Purbright gave a thin smile. Exactly. They set out at once, crossing the square beneath the lopsided bunting still fluttering from the festival. The rain had thinned to a soft mist, and the smell of damp hops still hung faintly in the air near the closed brewery. Miss Harbottle's small brick cottage stood beside the old post office, its windows trimmed with lace and a battered brass knocker shaped like a quill. She opened the door with a slightly flustered air, spectacles perched high on her nose, and an expression that vacillated between helpful and resigned. "Oh," she said. "I was expecting someone else." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Anyone in particular?" "No," she said too quickly, stepping aside. "Come in, please." "You'll have to excuse the mess. I've been reorganizing the family genealogy files." The mess was immaculate, not a cushion out of place. A fire burned gently behind a mesh guard, and the faint scent of lavender polish hung in the air. Love spotted it first, a blue handkerchief folded neatly on the sideboard, monogrammed with an L. It matched the one from the brewery. She noticed him staring and offered a polite smile. "Birthday gift," she said, "from the Ladies' Guild. They all got our initials wrong. Mine's actually J for Joan, but they thought Lillian was more poetic." Purbright smiled. "And where were you during the festival?" She blinked. "At the town hall, mostly. Coordinating the volunteer rota." "Why? You didn't attend the ale unveiling?" She hesitated. "No, I don't drink. Not since my brother's incident. It makes me nervous." "Curious," said Purbright. "Because we have a witness who places you near the brewery that morning." Not long before the barrel collapsed, her lips thinned. "Who?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward a small wooden cabinet. "May we see what's inside?" She tensed. "That's just personal correspondence." "I don't see how—" "Please." She opened it slowly. Inside were several folders, a tin of toffees, and a sealed envelope stamped "Copy Ledger 1990. Purbright took it, turned it over. "Miss Harbottle," he said gently. "Did Percy give this to you?" "No," she said. "He left it behind." In the council records room, he was careless. He didn't think anyone would recognize what it was. "Yet you did." "Because I helped type the original," she said softly, lowering herself into the armchair. "They all acted as though I were invisible, Inspector. Just the girl who files things. But I kept a copy. I always do. And when I saw him parading around with his original recipe nonsense, I knew he was planning to sell a lie to the council." Love spoke gently. "Did you confront him?" "No, I thought he might come clean. But when I saw him leave with that smug look, I realized he'd double-crossed Eunice and George and me all in one go. So I did the only thing I could." "You stole the real ledger?" She nodded. "And after that?" Her hands trembled slightly. "I hid it. And I told Widmerpool I had it. I thought maybe I could use it to stop the funding scheme. Make them admit the truth. But then Percy turned up dead, and I didn't know what to do." Purbright looked around the neat room once more, and then down at the woman who had, in her way, held all the strings. "And did you poison him, Miss Harbottle?" She met his eyes. "No, Inspector. I didn't kill him. I wanted to expose him, not end him. But someone else knew I had this." Purbright looked at the envelope again. Then he noticed the wax seal, half broken, not by them. Someone had opened it before. Purbright turned the envelope over in his hands again. The seal, meant to be intact, had been broken with surgical neatness, then resealed. The edges didn't quite meet, and the crease line along the flap had been reinforced with a dab of glue. It was the kind of alteration a tidy person might overlook, but not a meticulous one. He looked up. "Miss Harbottle, was this in your cabinet the entire time?" She nodded, her voice low. "I haven't touched it since I placed it there. I didn't even open it after I took it. I just wanted to keep it safe. And who else has been inside the house?" "No one," she said, but then hesitated. "Except Councillor Widmerpool. He came 2 days ago to deliver a notice about the festival budget. Some last-minute signatures needed. I thought nothing of it." Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "He wouldn't have known you had the ledger then, unless you told him." She hesitated again. "I might have mentioned I'd seen something interesting in the archive box." Just to make him nervous, Purbright nodded slowly. It worked. Back at the station, they laid the envelope out beneath a desk lamp. The document inside wasn't the original ledger, of course, but it was a complete copy. Typed, labeled, and annotated in an old, disciplined hand. Page 4 detailed the development process, ingredients trialed, batch notes, and fermenting times. and at the bottom of page 6, underlined, was a sentence that all but cracked the case wide open. Flavoring stabilizer, courtesy of R. Copley. Compound held in council storage under license agreement with municipal records. Expires 1995. Love sat up straighter. Copley's contribution wasn't just technical, it was chemical. Something unique. If someone else accessed that compound, Purbright nodded, and used it, either directly or as a model, for poison. But that was 30 years ago. Poisons don't go off, Purbright said mildly. Not the good ones. An hour later, they sat in the bowels of the town hall, in the musty, poorly lit municipal records basement. Miss Harbottle's keys had granted them access, and with the help of Constable Perks, they located the file storage case marked Expired Permits, 1990s, Miscellaneous. Inside was a yellowing folder marked Copley, Stabilizer, Use Certificate. Attached with a rusty paperclip was a lab analysis sheet, and beside it, a smaller envelope, unlabeled. Purbright opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in parchment, was a small dried vial. Tucked beneath it, a note. Experimental blend. Not for ingestion. Toxic if misused. Love exhaled. This was it. This is what someone used. They stared at the vial. The powder inside was faintly iridescent, like crushed pearl. "Let's be sure," said Purbright. "Have Doctor." Fergus run a chemical match against the contents of Proudfoot's stomach, quietly. As they emerged from the archive building, the weather had turned again, wind pulling at bunting, the taste of wood smoke in the air. Purbright paused outside the florist's, the photograph of the 4 collaborators still folded in his coat. "They all shared something once," he said. "Pride, success, and eventually resentment. The kind that curdles love." Looked across the square. "What about Widmerpool?" "He knew about the ledger," said Purbright. "He tried to get to it. Possibly already read it. But murder? I'm less convinced." "Why?" "Because Widmerpool doesn't kill," Purbright said dryly. "He undermines. He leaks. But murder requires mess and motive that outweighs personal caution." "Then who?" Purbright's gaze fell on a figure emerging from the bakery. Audrey Clenthrop, the mayor's wife. She moved with brisk efficiency, smiling broadly to passing townsfolk, but her hand shook as she dropped coins into her handbag. She crossed the square and paused briefly at the town hall steps. Her glance toward the station was brief, but telling. Purbright murmured, "Sometimes it isn't who brewed the poison. It's who had access to it after the brew was done." Love blinked. "You think she—" But Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he watched her disappear inside the council building and then turned back toward the station. Inside, waiting on his desk, was a small white envelope. No stamp, no address, just one word in firm cursive. Enough. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, the sort favored by old estate agents and defunct charities. Its single word, enough, was not scrawled in fear or haste, but written with a calm finality, as if the sender had composed it standing still in a very quiet room. Purbright held it between 2 fingers as though it might crumble. He opened it slowly. Inside, a single sheet. No signature, no greeting. Just 3 lines, typed on an old manual ribbon machine. "He betrayed us all. The formula never belonged to him. I made sure it died with him." Love read over his shoulder. "Doesn't say who wrote it." "Doesn't need to," Purbright said. "It's not confession. It's closure, but it proves someone's taking credit. Or crafting a story," Purbright murmured. He folded the note and slipped it into a fresh evidence sleeve. "Anonymous tips often tell us less about the truth than about the sender's fears." Love frowned. "You think it's a bluff?" "No," said Purbright. "I think it's theater. Someone wants to close the curtain on this before the next act begins." They didn't have long to wait. That evening, under an indigo sky with lanterns still flickering from the festival, the town council reconvened for an emergency session, ostensibly to discuss heritage grant protocols, but in reality to massage public panic and protect reputations. The chamber echoed with the low hum of concerned citizens and the officious shuffling of paper. Councillor Widmerpool, flanked by his usual air of importance, called the meeting to order. "We are gathered," he began, "not to speculate on the unfortunate demise of Mr. Proudfoot, but to ensure that the reputation of this town and the future of its cultural investments remain unblemished." There was a polite murmur. Audrey Clenthrop dabbed at her forehead with a lace-edged handkerchief. Purbright and Love sat unobtrusively at the back, neither in uniform nor announced, watching the room rather than the proceedings. It wasn't until the floor was open to community feedback that the tension began to coil. A tall woman in a mauve raincoat stood. Her voice was clear. "My name is Mrs. Farley. I just want to know whether the council intends to address the brewing license records." Specifically, the erased names Widmerpool blinked. "Madame, I believe those concerns are being handled by our administrative team." "Then why," she said, lifting a copy of the destroyed certificate from her handbag, "has one of the founding contributors to King's Bitter been deliberately removed from the official history?" Gasps rippled across the chamber. Purbright leaned slightly forward. Widmerpool blanched. I was not made aware of—" "Liar," came a quiet voice. It was Miss Harbottle, rising from the third row, her hands clasped tight before her. "You removed Copley's name yourself." "I saw you with the file, and I saw you replace the envelope on my shelf. I didn't say anything because I thought you were just trying to protect the grant. But now someone's dead." The chamber descended into whispers and coughs, and one audible, "Well, really," from a retired vicar's wife. Widmerpool spluttered. "Joan, that's preposterous." Purbright stood, his voice calm and steady. "Councillor Widmerpool, might we see you in private?" But Widmerpool's eyes flicked sideways, toward Audrey Clenthrop. She sat very still, her face composed, but her right hand trembled slightly as it adjusted the brooch on her lapel. Purbright followed his gaze. "Actually," he said, "perhaps both of you." The silence that followed was heavy. They adjourned to the mayor's side room where tea had been laid out in anticipation of a more ceremonial occasion. Purbright closed the door softly. "I'll ask only once," he said. "Did either of you handle the stabilizer compound, Copley's formula, after the archives were opened?" Widmerpool looked helpless. "I wouldn't know where to begin. I just wanted to smooth things over. The grant, the nameplates, the festival. I told Audrey we had to act fast." Purbright turned. "Mrs. Clenthrop?" She set her handbag on the table. "He was an odious man, Inspector. Arrogant, selfish. But I didn't kill him. Yet you had access. Your husband chaired the committee. You had reason. Proudfoot humiliated you publicly. Do you know what's worse than beer down your front, Inspector? Knowing that a man who once borrowed money from your late father used that money to blackmail your council." Love's eyes widened. "He blackmailed the council. Not openly, but subtly, always threatening to withdraw support, to reveal historical fraud over the heritage brews. My husband knew. So did George Tuddock. Percy had his hooks in half the chamber. And you decided to end it?" Purbright asked softly. "No, I decided to expose him, but someone beat me to it. I was going to poison his festival cask. Nothing fatal, just something unpleasant. A stomach turn, a lesson. But I never did. Because someone else had already taken a far darker path, Purbright was quiet. Then he opened his coat pocket and laid the anonymous note on the table. Her eyes flicked to it, unreadable. It wasn't me." He turned to Widmerpool. And you? I write too wordily, he muttered. Purbright said nothing more. He folded the note back into its sleeve and turned to Love. Have Constable Perks escort them home, he said. No charges yet. As they left, Purbright looked again at the envelope. The typewriter ink, faded but distinct, bore a faint smudge just below the last line. A thumbprint. The thumbprint was faint but unmistakable. A small, ridged smudge just below the word him. Left not in panic but carelessness. The sort of mistake made by someone used to going unnoticed. Purbright stared at it under the desk lamp, turning the envelope slowly between his fingers as though waiting for it to confess aloud. I'll have the print lifted, said Love, standing beside him. Get it to forensics. Purbright nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. Even if it comes back clean, the smudge tells us something. It wasn't handled with gloves. Whoever wrote this didn't expect it to be read with suspicion. Because they thought we were finished, Love asked. Because they thought we wouldn't look any deeper. Love sat down across from him. So where does that leave us? We've ruled out Tuddock, Eunice, Widmerpool, even Audrey Clenthrup. Ruled out as murderers, Purbright agreed, but not as enablers. Love rubbed his chin. You're thinking someone helped set the stage. Exactly. Proudfoot's murder wasn't just a private act. It was theatrical. Poison in the glass, staged rupture of the barrel, a slow drip of gossip. That takes timing, access, precision. He glanced at the wall clock. Come with me. They crossed the square once more, this time cutting through the cloisters behind the church, where early evening shadows bled into corners like spilt ink. The council buildings were mostly dark, but the light above the registry office flickered. Inside, behind a pile of document folders and loose-bound minutes, sat Lillian Harbottle. She looked up with a calmness that Purbright found immediately suspicious. You're back, she said simply. I am, he replied. We've spoken with everyone who had a stake in Proudfoot's deception. But we overlooked one person, someone who had no stake, someone who simply got tired of being erased. Her eyes didn't flicker. I don't know what you mean. Purbright reached into his coat and produced the envelope. Typed on a ribbon machine, just like the minutes you typed for the council last month. Same slight tilt on the lowercase e. Same faint ghosting on punctuation. She studied it briefly. So I believe you wrote this, he said quietly, and left it on my desk. Hoping we'd stop digging, I never denied typing it. Love looked startled. You didn't. She smiled faintly. I wanted the story told. But I didn't want the town ruined. People need the illusion more than they need the truth, Purbright. Set the envelope down. Then let me ask plainly. Did you poison Percy Proudfoot? She met his gaze evenly. No, I wanted him discredited, not dead. I wanted people to see that he'd built his little empire on other people's work. Mine, Copley's, even George Tuddock's flavor trials. But I didn't kill him. I simply took the copy of the formula and made sure he couldn't use it to control us again. And the handkerchiefs? Purbright asked. One at the brewery? One behind Tuddock's barrels? One in your hedge? She hesitated. Mine, yes. But I only ever used them. I never planted them. Someone's been playing with perception. Misdirection Love frowned. You're saying someone else had access to your things? Harbottle looked almost amused. Sergeant, you'd be surprised how many council members borrow from my drawer without asking. Audrey Clenthrup took a whole packet of those handkerchiefs during the summer fete. Purbright sat forward. So the E-monograms weren't yours? No, she said softly. That's the funny part. I don't even know who they belong to. I assumed Eunice. But the clue wasn't the initial, said Purbright. It was the habit, leaving personal tokens in strategic places. Someone wanted us to chase initials instead of intent. Love rubbed his forehead. Then we're back where we started. No, said Purbright quietly. We're almost there. He stood and looked down at Miss Harbottle. You said you wanted people to know the truth. But someone else wanted silence, not to protect the town, but themselves. She nodded. Then you know who did it. I do, he said. I only needed you to confirm the real motive. As they stepped back into the cool night, the street lamps had begun to glow amber. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang the quarter hour. Love cleared his throat. Sir, do I know? You will, said Purbright. Tonight. Back at the station, Constable Perks was waiting with a fresh envelope from Dr. Fergus. The lab report was short. Compound match? Confirmed. Origin, stabilizer sample. Council archives. Delivery method, dissolved into solution, administered via glass. Love read the line twice. So it's real. The poison came from Copley's compound, just like we thought, and it was handled recently, Purbright said. Meaning someone not only knew where it was, but felt comfortable retrieving it. He placed the report beside the photograph, the one with the 4 collaborators. Then, with slow precision, he tapped the image of the man standing just out of alignment, the odd one, the chemist. Roderick Copley, Purbright said. He never got credit. But someone remembered him. Love tilted his head. Miss Harbottle? Purbright shook his head. No, he said softly. Someone else loved him. The last piece fell into place not with a clang, but a soft thud, like the settling of a barrel in sand, or the closing of a quiet ledger. Purbright stood before the photograph again, staring not at the names, but the space between them, the narrow gap where Roderick Copley's figure had been slotted like a postscript. The man behind the stabilizer, behind the formula, behind, always behind. And just to his left, barely in the frame, a hand rested on his shoulder. A hand with short nails, no jewelry, the sleeve crisp and modest. Not a brewer's hand, not a drinker's, a caretaker's, a librarian's, or a widow's. Purbright's gaze flicked to the other faces in the photo, then back to the one detail no one else had questioned. The brooch. At precisely 9:30 that evening, under a thin fog that rolled over Flaxborough's rooftops like spilt cream, Purbright and Love knocked at the front door of Eunice Cribbin's house on Quarley Crescent. She answered in her usual cardigan, hair pinned back in its war-era tightness, the same scent of lavender and yeast lingering about her. I suppose I knew you'd return, she said softly. Come in, Inspector. They entered without a word, following her into the sitting room, where a small fire glowed and beeswax candles flickered along the mantel. No signs of panic, no last-minute tidy. Everything was in its place. I won't ask if you'd like tea, she said. There's none left worth serving. Purbright stood by the hearth. We matched the compound, Mrs. Cribbin. It was lifted from council storage, accessed not long after your visit to the archives. She sat slowly. I see. You were the only one who could have known both where the stabilizer was stored and what it could do. She looked at the fire. Roderick warned me, all those years ago. He told me it was too dangerous to use, but Percy, he said a hint of it gave the beer something special, that no one would notice if it was diluted. Love spoke gently. So you knew what it could do? I knew, she said. I just never thought I'd be the one to use it. Purbright waited. She continued in a voice drained of all pretense. After Roderick died, Percy promised me we'd honor his work. He said we'd share the credit. But every year it was one more event without mention, one more bottle without his name, and then, this year, when he offered to sell the ledger, to Widmerpool, to Tuddock, to whoever paid most, I realized it would never change. Percy wasn't protecting the past. He was selling it off by the ounce. So you poisoned him? Love asked. She shook her head. Not at first. I wanted him shamed. I wanted to ruin his festival moment. I even poured a weak dose into one of the barrels the night before, enough to make someone sick, perhaps cause a scandal. But he never tapped that barrel. He switched them. Purbright frowned. So someone else administered the poison? No, she said. I did. Later, she rose and walked to the corner cabinet, opening a drawer and removing a folded cloth pouch. Inside, a small brown bottle, no label, the cork sealed with wax. I found him in the office, she said, after the crowd had thinned, after he'd made his speeches and let Audrey Clenthrop slip on beer foam. He was gloating, drinking from his glass. He didn't see me come in. I poured a few drops from the bottle into the decanter on his shelf and left. The glass he drank from was filled again by him. Why not just confront him? Love asked, bewildered. She looked at him with calm sadness. Because men like Percy Proudfoot never listen to women like me. They nod, they patronize, they give you £70 for your silence. But they never hear you. She handed the bottle to Purbright, then turned back to the fire. I didn't want to kill him. But when I realized he'd sold Roderick's legacy, after everything, I knew he'd destroy it completely, one name at a time. So I let him drink, and I walked out. There was a long silence. Miss Harbottle, Purbright said gently, was the one who copied the ledger. She preserved the truth. You, Mrs. Cribben. You sealed it. She nodded. I know. They walked her quietly to the car, no cuffs, no shouting. The fog muffled the street, and not a single window lit as she passed. Eunice Cribben did not resist. She only glanced once toward the market square, where the barrels had stood, and murmured, "He said Roderick's compound gave it depth. But all it gave us was silence." At the station, she signed her statement with a steady hand. And by morning, the town began to stir again. The gossip resumed, just a little softer. A new sign went up in the pub window, temporarily closed for maintenance, and in a quiet ceremony, attended only by Miss Harbottle, a modest plaque was placed on the brewery wall. In memory of our couple, who gave Flaxborough its flavor and never asked for credit.